Welcome to this HIS 4470 lecture, Talking to Strangers, Conducting the Interview. You don't begin by simply going to someone's house and interviewing them. There are preliminaries to the interview in which you must work with your narrator. Set up a preliminary meeting, a pre-interview meeting, by contacting the narrator, making arrangements for the meeting, contacting them again by letter with your appointment for the preliminary meeting. At this point, set up some ground rules. Note the place of the meeting. If you are going to interview in a room with background noise, see if you can change the room, make sure everyone is comfortable, note the plugs, note the need for extension cords, and note any activity that's going on in and around the room. The room may not be satisfactory. Agree to the number of narrators at this pre-interview meeting. Sometimes it's better to get more narrators, sometimes it's better to get fewer narrators. The default position for most oral historians is to interview one person at a time, and there are a number of reasons for this that we'll go over in a future lecture. Again, understand the physical space in which the interview will take place so that you can make a plan about how you will set up when you arrive for the interview. On the day of the interview, make sure that you arrive on time. Do not arrive too early. The narrator will know that you're outside and will become nervous and you'll become nervous, but don't arrive late either. Set up according to your plan, but of course be flexible. When you begin the actual interview, don't begin by turning on the recorder. Have a chat with the person first. Let them know that you will go through some preliminary information with them, that you will ask them to do certain things like spell their name, and that you'll ask them to agree on tape to be interviewed. Let them know that you'll do some things on tape that will not be in the edited interview, but that you will also script a formal opening. Remember for yourself and inform your narrator that this interview is a raw product, not an edited product. When everyone is comfortable, read your scripted formal opening that should include your name, the nature of the project, the date, the general place of the interview, who is there. Have them spell and say their name, and then have them agree to be interviewed on tape. You want to build rapport, and so doing that requires you to understand the stages of the interview situation. The first stage is apprehension. Both you and particularly the narrator will be a little bit nervous about the interview process. This, we hope, gives way to exploration, where the two of you begin to feel each other out. Eventually, this should turn into cooperation. But the most important level of rapport to achieve is full participation. These four stages are fairly well documented, fairly well laid out, and if you recognize that they exist and plan for them, then you can help guide the building of rapport. Another way to help with the building of rapport is to actively engage by active listening and active questioning. By active listening and active questioning, you let that narrator know that you think what they have to say is important. This goes along with responding to the narrator appropriately. Most narrators will try to second guess you at least a little bit because they want you to legitimize their answers, at least the direction that they're going. This will require a little bit of flexibility on your part and probably a great deal of patience as the narrator in particular works through these stages of apprehension, exploration, cooperation before finally getting comfortable enough to fully participate. We'll have a couple of slides now about the types of questions. In general, we talk about two overarching genres of questions. One is the open-ended question. The other is the closed-ended question. An open-ended question provides a topic to which the narrator can respond in their own way. It allows the narrator to tell their own story, and it is considered the best kind of question to ask generally. Now, the closed-ended question seeks a finite answer to a finite question. Frequently, it's a confirmation of a detail. Often it can be answered in yes or no. Although most oral history interview guides will tell you to avoid closed-end questions, most of them also recognize that once in a while you have to ask a closed-ended question in order to get the narrator through a particularly problematic point, and it might be something as simple as somebody forgot a piece of information or needed to stop and think or something like that. But do not default to closed-ended questions. Stick with open-ended questions. And some of the best things that you can do are to script some open-ended questions, not just with a phrase, but with an entire sentence, an entire question. That way, if you get stuck, you have something right before you that you can simply read to the narrator. Let's continue with the types of questions, and let me explain some of these that you see before you here. The probing question, use it to elicit a more complete response, and it may take the form of inviting the narrator to go into greater detail, to think about things more deeply, and to express more thoroughly what it is that they're trying to say. You can ask a narrator to define a word or an idea if they are speaking in some kind of professional or group jargon or code. Alternately, you can ask a narrator to deconstruct a phrase or a word that they have used. That is, explain not only what it is, but what it means in the greater context of what they themselves are speaking about. Another probing question can get at the emotions associated with the facts that a narrator is recounting. And that's a very simple question to ask. How did you feel about that? A follow-up question is similar to a probing question, and let me make an aside here to say that there are few hard and fast types of questions. The question types you see before you here are really analytical categories. When you start applying these questions, a follow-up and a reason why and a clarification and a probing all look alike. They all sound alike. But when you're thinking about how to do this process, it's good to separate them out to make sure that you've covered all of the information that you need to cover in order to understand the type of question. Anyway, a follow-up, again, similar to a probing question, in which you pick up on a clue in the narrator's statement and then you pursue that clue. You might use a leading or a suggestive question, suggesting that the narrator respond in a particular direction. As Yao notes on page 118 of her third edition, when she discusses the millwork interviewer who used a suggestion that the company could have done more for the workers at Christmas, that elicited a follow-up, a probe, to the narrator about how the company actually treated the employees. A similar set of questions are the reason why questions. This probes principally for motivation, and it's usually fairly straightforward. Again, why did this occur? Why did you follow this particular line? Clarification questions keeps both the interviewer and the narrator on track and talking about the same thing. If you or your narrator appear confused, especially about chronology, which is often problematic in oral history, use a clarifying question. It can help break up a pattern of thought. But be aware, it can break up a pattern of thought. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. You might again use a leading question, or you might use a closed-ended question to get clarification. This helps capture on the recording some of the subtle nonverbal clues that accompany vague articulations. If you see somebody nodding or fidgeting or something like that, you can ask them to clarify what it is that they're trying to say. You can also pose hypothetical questions, also known as what-if questions. This allows the narrator to expand on their inner lives, the one they might have lived had circumstances and choices been different. This is good for indirectly examining motivations of those in the history the narrator is recounting. Why did people do what they did? What if they had had this choice available to them? How might they have responded? Another good question to use is a comparison question. Now, this requires that the narrator be an analytical person who can tease out the components of the things you want them to compare. Oftentimes, the narrator is not necessarily deeply analytical, and so a comparison question might be a difficult one to ask. If you want to compare X and Y and get the narrator to expand on how they would compare X to Y, you may have to use a slightly different kind of question. You may have to approach it through clarification or through probing, or you may even need to ask a series of closed-ended questions to get them moving in that direction. Generally, you have to give them a little time to think about what it is they want to say. The challenge question can be high risk. It requires a level of trust and comfort, so you can't go too quickly to a challenge question. It demands careful wording on your part, and it demands careful delivery. If the narrator becomes uncomfortable with the challenge, then stop the questioning. You don't want to offend the narrator, and you don't want the narrator to shut down or lose rapport with you. Sometimes your approach to questions might require a two-part or a two-sentence question. This is a question in which the interviewer sets up a scenario to either narrow the range of possible answers or to provide context for why the interviewer is asking the question in the first place. That is, the first part of the question is a statement that establishes the parameter of the answer or the motivation for the question itself, and the second part is the question designed to elicit an answer. You might, for example, pose a challenge question by saying something like, historians of X have thought that things occurred this way for this reason. You're discussing your experience with those things. Would you agree with them, and can you expand on your answer? This is a good way to use a two-part question to ask a challenge question. Asking questions can lead to potential trouble. One of the most difficult things is a diminishing rapport, and this may happen inadvertently. Remember that the narrator often is exposing themselves, making themselves vulnerable. And if they perceive that you have made a moral judgment about the things they're discussing, and that moral judgment does not agree with them, or worse, that you have made a moral judgment about them, then you might be responsible for diminishing rapport. Another potential problem is distress from the narrator. You might see this manifest in nonverbal clues like fidgetiness, shuffling, and other movements indicating either distraction or impatience. Watch for the narrator trying to gain control of the interview or shutting down to avoid the question. One way that a narrator might try to gain control of the interview is by going off topic or dominating the conversation or obfuscating their answers. An obvious sign of potential trouble is that the narrator cries. On the other hand, this is not necessarily an attempt to stop the line of questioning. It might simply be a signal about how important The answer is to the narrator. You might have tapped into something that's unpleasant, but the narrator may want to talk about it. They just have an emotional response to it. Nevertheless, you have a responsibility to figure that out. Remember, this is an interview, not an interrogation. And along that same line, potential trouble occurs when the narrator has an error of fact. If errors of fact do not affect the story, just let them go. If they're larger errors, consider asking a clarifying question. Chronology in oral history recounting is always problematic because of the way time and memory and events interact. Alessandro Portelli noted that historians are interested in accurate reconstructions of the past, while oral history narrators are more interested in, quote, protecting an image, unquote, of what was significant to them. You have different reasons for being in the interview and a different approach to the information that is going on in the interview. And what Portelli notes is that sometimes a commonly shared error in a community has an import that accuracy doesn't play a part of. So how do you cope with this error of fact? Well, you can allow the narrator to proceed and question the narrator about the inaccuracies gently and at a later time. However, if the narrator insists on retaining what you believe to be an error of fact, then in the field notes, indices, and transcriptions, you can add an editorial comment by which you note the discrepancy between your sources and what the narrator is telling you. Obviously, you've got to dive into this in order to understand most of the things that can occur during an interview, both good and bad. But at the end, you have to complete that interview. Script a formal ending, just like you scripted a formal beginning. Include a recap of that introductory information. What happens if you lose the first few minutes of the interview? If you've recapped at the end of the interview all of the important information that identifies yourself, the narrator, the date, the time, the place of the interview, the reason for the interview, the project you're working on, all of that information that you worked in the beginning will be there in a second spot. Redundancy is frequently a good thing when you're dealing with technology, digital or analog recordings. Thank the narrator on tape. Say aloud what you will use the interview for and what project it's part of and how you think you will dispose of the interview. And say at some point, this concludes the interview. After the interview, once you've turned off the tape recorder, and let me make an aside here to say, if they begin talking again, which happens fairly frequently, turn the tape recorder back on, but anytime you turn the tape recorder back on, you have to tell them that you have turned the tape recorder back on, and it is best practice to get them to agree that they understand that it's back on and that you can record. They give you permission to record. Capture whatever they're speaking about, and then when it is completely finished, thank them again. Say again, this concludes the interview. At the very end of the process, secure the signed release and, wherever appropriate, the archival gift agreement. Of course, if they are reluctant to sign the release or if they want to look at it some more, let them do so. You can always come back later. Again, it's a matter of patience. One way to avoid this kind of problem is to have sent them a draft version of it in the pre-interview process. Either deliver the draft version to them so they can look it over, or mail it to them when you send them a letter, which you should, confirming all of the details of your interview appointment. When you get home, Finish your paperwork about the narrator while all of this is fresh in your mind. Also, while it's fresh in your mind, index or transcribe the interview. It's so much easier than having to listen to it 3 and 4 times. Finally, review your own work using Yao's interviewing skills checklist in her 3rd edition, pages 129 to 130. Then apply the lessons you've learned to your next interview. This concludes the lecture. And as always, thank you very much for your attention.